Memory is not a recording. This is the thing that makes what happened to Sasha so possible and so devastating and so difficult to defend against once it started. Memory is not a camera. It is not a file saved to a hard drive that you can pull up and play back with timestamp and full fidelity intact. Memory is a reconstruction. Every single time you remember something, you are not retrieving a fixed file. You are rebuilding it from fragments, from emotion, from context, from everything that has happened to you since the original event occurred. Scientists have known this for decades. Lawyers know this. And some people, a very specific kind of person with a very specific understanding of how the human mind works and a willingness to use that understanding as a weapon, they know it too. What they know is this. If you can get someone to rebuild a memory in a slightly different way enough times, you can eventually replace the original with the version you prefer. Not through force, not through argument, through patience and repetition and the particular authority that comes from being the person who is supposed to love you most. Sasha spent 2 years inside this process without knowing it was a process. By the time she understood what had been done to her, she had almost lost access to her own history. Almost. Welcome to Venom Thread, where the truth is darker than fiction. And tonight the story we are telling begins not with a betrayal, but with something colder and more deliberate. The systematic rewriting of one woman's past by the man who knew it better than anyone and used that knowledge to make her doubt every single thing that had ever happened between them. Her name was Sasha, and she was 34 years old when she met a man named Marcus at a literary event in the city where she had lived for 6 years. She worked in publishing and she was good at it, and she had built a life that she was genuinely proud of. Not a perfect life, not an easy one, but one that was coherent and self-made, and that reflected who she actually was rather than who she thought she was supposed to be. Marcus was a writer. Not famous, not yet, but serious and disciplined and possessed of the particular intelligence that draws people in because it makes them feel seen rather than examined. He had read things she had read. He had opinions about those things that were close to her opinions, but not identical, and the difference between his opinions and hers created a productive friction that she associated, in those early months, with intellectual compatibility. What she was actually experiencing was something different. She was experiencing a person who had done significant preparation, who had learned enough about her taste and her thinking before their first real conversation to occupy the specific intellectual territory she found most attractive. He was not discovering that he agreed with her. He was positioning himself in the places where agreement would have the most impact. She did not know this yet. She thought she had met someone rare. She had, just not in the way she believed. They were together for 2 years before the first incident. Not a confrontation. Not an argument in the ordinary sense. An incident. The word she uses for it is specific and deliberate, and she has explained why she uses it. Because what happened was not a fight, not a misunderstanding, not the normal friction of two people navigating a shared life. It was a moment in which she discovered something about Marcus that contradicted the version of himself he had been presenting to her, and she confronted him with it, and he responded in a way that she did not have a category for yet. He denied it. Not aggressively. Not dismissively. He denied it with the specific texture of a person who is genuinely confused by the accusation. He looked at her with an expression of patient hurt, and he said, "That is not what happened." And she said, "Yes, it is, I was there." And he said, "I know you were there, but I think you are remembering it differently from how it occurred." And she said, "I am not misremembering this." And he said, "I am not saying you are lying. I am saying that sometimes when we are in an emotional state, we encode things imprecisely, and then when we retrieve the memory, we retrieve it with the imprecision intact, and we experience that imprecision as fact." He said this calmly and with the vocabulary of someone who had clearly read about memory and coding, and she stood in their kitchen and felt, for the first time, the specific disorientation of having your own experience return to you with an explanation attached that made the experience's accuracy the variable rather than the event's occurrence. She let it go. This is not a failure on her part, and it is important to say that clearly. She let it go because the explanation he gave was not insane. Memory is reconstructive. She knew this. She was an intelligent and well-read person, and the argument he made had the structure of a reasonable argument, even though its function was not reasonable at all. This is how the first rewrite succeeds. not because the target is credulous, but because the argument is designed to exploit the exact amount of epistemic humility that thoughtful and self-aware people carry as a matter of intellectual honesty. Sasha was thoughtful and self-aware. She had always been someone who checked herself, who allowed for the possibility that she might be wrong. And he had identified this about her in the first months of their relationship, and he had understood that this quality, which in any other context was a strength, was the specific entry point he needed. He did not attack her certainty. He appealed to her uncertainty. And the appeal worked because she was the kind of person who responded to reasonable-sounding arguments about her own fallibility with genuine consideration rather than instinctive resistance. The second rewrite came 3 months later. The third came 6 weeks after that. Each one followed the same architecture. An incident in which she discovered something that contradicted his presented self. A confrontation in which she named what she had found. A response from Marcus that was calm and patient and that reframed the confrontation not as her holding him accountable, but as her memory producing an inaccurate version of events. He never raised his voice. He never called her names. He never did any of the things that would have been recognizable as the behavior of a person doing something wrong. He simply, persistently, and with increasing sophistication, offered her alternative explanations for her own experiences and waited for her to choose between his explanation and her own recollection. And because his explanations were always more generous to her than her recollections, because the version in which she had misremembered was always the version in which she was not a person being deceived, but a person with a natural human tendency toward imprecise encoding, she kept choosing them. Not because she was weak, because the alternative required her to accept that the person she loved was systematically lying to her, and that the relationship she had built her adult life around for 2 years was a construction specifically designed to survive exactly this kind of scrutiny. By the end of year 2, she had a relationship with her own past that she described to me later as fractured. She knew things had happened. She had experienced them. But overlaid on every significant memory was a second version, the corrected version, the Marcus-approved version, and the two versions occupied the same space in her mind simultaneously, and she could no longer always tell which one had come first. She had started, without consciously deciding to, cross-referencing her memories against things she had written at the time, texts, emails, diary entries, because these records predated the corrections, and therefore contained the original version before the rewrite could reach them. She did this secretly. She felt, while doing it, a shame she could not entirely explain. The shame of a person who has been made to feel that her own mind requires external verification. She was checking her memories against evidence the way you check a suspect alibi. The suspect was herself. The alibi was her own lived experience. And the person who had put her in this position had done so, without ever once raising his voice or calling her a liar, because he never had to. He had found a much more efficient method, and he had been refining it for 2 years. The moment everything changed arrived not through a confrontation, but through an accident of timing. Sasha had left her phone recording in her jacket pocket while she went back into the apartment for something she had forgotten. Marcus did not know the recording was running. She did not know it was running either. She had been recording a voice memo earlier and had not stopped it when she put the phone away. The recording ran for 47 minutes while she was in the apartment, and Marcus was in the adjacent room and had a conversation he would later insist had never taken place. Not with Sasha, with someone on his own phone. The conversation was not about her directly, but it was about the management of the situation, his words, not hers. The exact phrase he used when describing to whoever was on the other end of that call the process by which he kept her uncertain enough to be manageable. That is the word he used. Manageable. She listened to the 47 minutes alone sitting in her car in a parking garage, and she felt, in the sequence of emotions that followed, something she had not felt in 2 years, certainty. Not the corrected kind. The original kind. The kind that belonged entirely to her, and that he had never had access to because he had not known it was being formed. She did not go back inside the apartment that night. She drove to her closest friend's house, and she stayed there, and she did not tell anyone yet what was on the recording, because she needed time with it before she introduced it to the world where it could be argued about and contextualized, and potentially reframed by someone who was very good at reframing things. She listened to it 4 more times over the next 2 days. She transcribed it word for word into a document on her laptop. She sent the audio file to 3 different cloud storage accounts that Marcus did not have access to. She sent a copy to her closest friend with a note that said, "Keep this somewhere, I cannot ask you to delete it." She was, in those 48 hours, building a redundancy into the evidence that reflected what 2 years of living with a person who rewrote things had taught her about the fragility of a single source. She was applying the lessons of the manipulation to the undoing of it. She had been educated by the wrong person in the right skills, and she was going to use everything he had taught her about the erasability of records to ensure that this particular record could not be erased. The confrontation happened on a Thursday evening. She had chosen the timing deliberately, not impulsively, not in the first heat of the discovery, but after 48 hours of preparation that included not just the redundant storage of the audio, but a call to an attorney who specialized in cases involving coercive control, and a separate call to a friend who had been through something adjacent and who had specific practical advice about how to conduct a confrontation with a person who was practiced at turning confrontations into evidence of the confronter's instability. The advice was this: do not let him see the recording first. Let him speak first. Let him build his version of events in real time without knowing you have the original. Give him enough space to construct the rewrite, and then introduce the recording into the space he has just filled with the rewrite. Let the recording do the work that your memory could not do, not because your memory was ever wrong, but because the recording is a form of certainty that cannot be argued with the way your memory can be argued with. She followed this advice exactly. She let him speak for 11 minutes. She let him construct, in real time and at considerable verbal length, and with his characteristic patient fluency, a version of the previous 2 years that reframed every incident she raised as a product of her imprecise encoding and her tendency toward emotional interpretation of neutral events. And then she pressed play. What followed was not dramatic in the cinematic sense of the word. There was no shouting. There was no moment where he crumbled and confessed to everything with tears running down his face. What happened was quieter and more absolute than that. He listened to his own voice for 30 seconds, and then he stopped listening, and she watched his face go through a sequence of expressions that she later described as the sequence a person's face goes through when the story they have been telling themselves about who they are encounters something that the story cannot survive. He tried, once, to suggest that the recording might be, and here he used a specific word that she remembered exactly, ambiguous. She said nothing. She pressed play again from the beginning. He did not try again after that. The rewriting system requires the cooperation of the person being rewritten. It requires their willingness to choose between their own experience and the alternative version being offered. The recording removed that choice entirely. There was no longer a choice to make. There was only what had happened. And what had happened was on the phone in her hand playing at full volume in the apartment they had shared, and it was in his voice, and it used the word manageable, and there was nothing left to rewrite. The exit from the relationship was handled by an attorney and was efficient. There were shared assets, an apartment lease, furniture, financial entanglements of the ordinary kind that accumulate over 2 years of shared life. And these were divided with the particular speed of a process in which one party has documentation and the other does not. Marcus did not contest anything. She attributed this later not to remorse, but to the specific calculation of a person who understood that contesting anything would require his own voice to be heard in a formal context where it would be compared against the recording and where he could not control the narrative the way he had controlled it for 2 years. He took what was offered. He left. She has not heard from him since the day the lease was transferred into her name alone, and she has not sought contact, and does not expect to, and has organized her life in the interim in such a way that the absence of contact is structural rather than dependent on either party's goodwill. I sat with Sasha for a long time when she told me this story. Longer than I usually sit with people. Not because the facts required more time. They were laid out with a precision and a chronological clarity that reflected the documentation habit she had developed during the relationship and had kept afterward. But because there was something in the way she described the moment of playing the recording that I wanted to understand fully before we ended. I asked her what it had felt like to hear his voice describing her as manageable. And she was quiet for a while. And then she said, "It did not feel like betrayal. I think I had expected it to feel like betrayal, the final confirmation of something I had already known but not been able to prove. But betrayal implies that there was a relationship being betrayed, and by the time I heard the recording, I understood that there had not been a relationship in the way I had experienced it. There had been a project, and I was the project, and the recording was just the project manager describing the status of the project in terms he would have used with any client about any work in progress. She paused. She said, "The thing about being someone's project without knowing it is that the work they are doing on you feels like love from the inside. Every correction feels like care. Every rewrite feels like patience. You think you are being loved imperfectly by someone who is trying hard. You are not. You are being managed efficiently by someone who has decided that managing you is easier than being honest with you. And the difference between those two things is the whole story." Thank you for being here on Venom Thread tonight. If this reached you where you needed it to reach you, share it. Subscribe and hit the notification bell. New darkness next week, and we are nowhere near done.